I'm Dave Champion. Let's talk about COVID-19 and flattening the curve. Now, before I get started, I want to apologize. You can probably all hear that my voice is trash. I live in southern Nevada. There's a lot of greenery here that I'm allergic to. So when spring hits and all the pollen goes crazy, well, I end up sounding like this for a couple of weeks. So I apologize for that. Now, what is flattening the curve? Well, it looks like this. And where do we go from there? And that's pretty much everything anybody knows about flattening the curve, especially what it takes in reality, in the real world, to flatten that curve. In a practical sense, what does flattening the curve actually mean? It's not about reducing the total number of infections. Flattening the curve is about extending the number of infections over the greatest period of time. Let's look at the chart again. As you can see, the high curve is when society does nothing to flatten the curve. That is the natural progression of the average virus. As you can see, the flatter curve is what happens when society makes an effort to flatten the curve. So, why would we want to flatten the curve? Well, there's one reason and one reason only for that. And that is our medical system, and basically the medical system of any society on earth, is geared to, is designed for, has developed in such a way that it serves the average, ordinary flow of people who need medical care. It is not built, it is not designed, it is not capable of handling the influx, the sudden spike of people who are ill from a pandemic. Crunching the best numbers I've been able to come across, I came up with that 5% of all the infected persons will need some sort of critical care. Now, I want to distinguish, because the number is much higher if you just say, if you look at a hospital and you say, well, look at this percentage that's gone to the hospital. There is a difference between need, in other words, if this guy doesn't get in the hospital, he's going to die, and somebody who's admitted to the hospital out of an abundance of caution who may go home and be just fine. Okay, so people who absolutely need medical care for COVID-19, my numbers that I came up with is about 5% of the population. So if we could just snap our fingers in this hypothetical and suddenly 30 million people had COVID-19 tomorrow, just 24 hours, boom, 30 million people, clearly 5% would be far more people than we could get into the hospitals, because hospitals have to have special protocols when it comes to infectious diseases. And a lot of that 5% I'm talking about usually needs to be an ICU. And there just simply aren't enough rooms and beds and hospital and staff and gear to go around if you've got 5% of 30 million people infected. That's the impetus. That exaggerated example explains why there is a desire to flatten that curve. In other words, if we spread all those cases, we're not diminishing the number of cases, but instead of having this all happen in, say, 4 weeks, we can make this happen in 4 months. Then we have enough people getting sick incrementally, we can get them into the hospital, treat them, and get them out. That's the basis. Okay, so now that we understand flattening the curve and we understand its benefit, I don't believe most people understand what it's going to take to flatten the curve. It's something that, as we just discussed here, that you look at it and you say, that's rational, it's common sense, my sense of empathy and sympathy for people who are ill, this is the way we need to go. Okay, so what if flattening the curve required you not to have any income for 4 months? Still a good idea? In order to understand what might be required or not required to flatten the curve, let's start with the most dramatic thing we could talk about, which is individual isolation. But for the sake of this initial illustration, let's say that we could take every single one of the 330 million people in the United States and stick them in their own little isolation pod for 4 weeks. If we could do that, the COVID-19 pandemic, at least in the United States, would be over if we could keep every single person in their own little isolation pod for 4 weeks. Of course, that's a nonsense scenario, so let's step back and look at what would be less than that. Again, let's talk about taking 330 million Americans and putting them each one in their own little isolation pod for 2 weeks. What would that accomplish? Well, what that would accomplish is that at the end of 2 weeks, probably in 99.9% of the cases, we would know who has the COVID-19 virus active in them, who's sick, and who doesn't have it. And that's a good thing to know, right? Yeah, well, there's a weakness in that plan too, and that is there's a certain unknown percentage, because nobody's been able to fix the exact percentage yet. There's a certain unknown percentage of people who have the virus. It is active within them, but they're asymptomatic. It doesn't manifest in any way. So they would appear to be, in this 2-week scenario, they would appear to be the people who aren't affected. And in reality, they would be not only infected, but contagious. But of course, keeping 330 million people in their own isolation pods for 2 weeks is also nonsensical. I offer those merely to illustrate what could and could not be done in the most extreme type of example, but it's fanciful, right? So what's going on in the real world? Well, in the real world, there are some places that are not doing anything. There are other places like California and New York that are taking rather stringent measures. So what are those stringent measures? Well, we're closing all non-essential businesses and we're telling people stay home. Depending on the locale, that's between 2 weeks to here, for instance, where I live in Nevada, it's 30 days. If we're not keeping everyone home, we're still allowing a significant percentage of the population, right? They have to go grocery shopping. They have to go to the doctor for non-COVID-19 stuff. They have to go to the pharmacy. They might be in an essential business where they go and then they're working with other people and so forth. I just drove by today. I saw 2 guys standing in a parking lot. They had their arms up on the bed rail of a pickup truck and they were chit-chatting in a parking lot and they were probably this far apart. So the social distancing thing is questionable to begin with, right? Whether people are actually following through with that. Just as unlikely as having individual isolation pods for all 330 million Americans is the idea that there's going to be some sort of draconian government enforcement of the business shutdowns and the stay-at-home orders and the social distancing. There's no way to police that. It's basically telling the public, please do this for our mutual good. I said there are tons of exceptions. You can't police everybody. So with tons of exceptions, and you can't police everybody, how is this going to play out in terms of flattening the curve? How significant are we going to flatten the curve in, as I said, some jurisdictions are 2 weeks, some are 3 weeks, some are 4 weeks. How far are we going to flatten that curve? And that is an unknown because there is no one on the planet who can calculate all the variables unless you could control everything and everyone, and we can't. So is it likely that we're going to have the outcome we want in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks? No, it's very unlikely we're going to get to the outcome we want. That outcome, of course, being what you see here in the chart as the lower curve. That's what we're looking for, and that's what, unless you can control everything and everyone, you're not going to do a very good job of hitting that mark if you tell people, don't go to work, stay home for 2, 3, 4 weeks. It's not going to happen. How do we know it's not going to happen? Well, there's a number of locales throughout the United States that have been on lockdown for a week or 2 weeks. I don't think anybody's hit 3 weeks yet. And the number of cases is climbing considerably. It's just the math doesn't work out. All right, so if the math doesn't work out on 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 30 days, what math does work? Well, again, it's an unknown because we can't control all the variables. However, it's very likely that in order to achieve this objective, there would have to be a lot more people restricted to their homes. It would have to be enforced, which is absolutely impossible, by the way. And it would probably have to go on more like 3 or 4 months. In that eventuality, what that means is if you're the average ordinary person who's not in an essential industry, you cannot work from home. It means that in order to hit this goal of flattening the curve sufficiently that we can care for, which every empathetic person would want, that we could care for all the people, that 5% I talked about earlier on, who are in need, absolute need of care from a hospital. To hit that mark, we'd probably have to stay in this business shutdown, lockdown, stay in your homes for 90 to 120 days. And even that's presumptive because, as I said, there's so many variables we can't control. I say all of that to ask you a question. If you are not one of the people who can work from home or are an essential industry, so you're getting paid while all this is going on, can you afford not to have any income for 3 months or for 4 months, 16 weeks without a paycheck? I'm guessing even the large bulk of middle-class Americans simply cannot hold on. Now, there's all sorts of things people are talking about. Well, you could tell car companies they can't repo cars. You could tell mortgage companies that they can't foreclose. Yeah, okay, and the federal government has already done that. The federal government agencies that have mortgages, that carry mortgages, they've already said they're not going to do any evictions or foreclosures during this period. However, there's no way to mandate that people who have contracts don't need to honor the contracts. There's nothing in American jurisprudence that would permit the government to interfere in private contracts like that. A perfect illustration of that is one particular property management company sent out an email to the people that were renting through that property management company and said, due to the COVID-19 situation, our offices are going to be closed. Oh, and by the way, your rent is still due on the 1st. Let's pluck a number out of the air, because we can't know for sure, and say 35% of the American working public cannot go more than 2 or 3 or 4 weeks without a paycheck. If that's true, which I believe that's probably a pretty accurate number, about 35% would be in that boat. If they can't go 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, they clearly cannot go 3 or 4 months. But Dave, they cry, the government is going to be sending out assistance payments. Okay, so let me tell you that system is broken from day one. Whatever payments the government eventually distributes is going to be months down the road, well after all of the personal damage has been done. And some people want us to be aware of the number of people who, if they have to go without a paycheck for 2 months or 3 months, their world, as far as they can see, how they see the world, their world has been destroyed, so they commit suicide. What are those numbers going to be? Given all that we've covered so far, what if it simply isn't possible to flatten the curve and still survive? What do we do then? The answer to that is unpleasant and may even be brutal. And it may be the only choice we have. If we come to the determination that the stay-at-home orders, the business closures, the lockdowns are not sustainable for the period of time that it would truly take to flatten that curve, then the only choice we have is to open the businesses back up, tell everyone, go about your business. Social distancing, yes, but on the whole, go back to the way your lives were before we said stay home and closed all the businesses. And what would be the consequence of that? Well, I think it's fairly obvious. The disease would spread rapidly. Those who would biologically become infected and get sick would become biologically infected and get sick. And we would have the unpleasant part of this chart. And we would have a number of people who need critical care who would not get it and likely die. I'm not sure there's a good answer here. And I'm not trying to paint that one is good and one is bad, because I don't think there's any good answer here. I think what is plainly evident is we cannot shut the United States economy down for 3 or 4 months. No, very few people, tiny percentage of the population could actually survive that. By comparison, to the number of people who would die if we said, go back to how your lives were. So we have a pandemic, and when you have a pandemic, if there are some really great hunky-dory answers, I don't know what they are, and I don't think you do either. But I wanted to draw the distinction between the course of action we have thus far embarked on and what the alternative is. And as we look at these, what might be the elements that play into we like this approach, or we've tried this approach and it's failing, or the math doesn't bear out the results that we're trying to accomplish. So I think we need to take all these factors into consideration in our national discussion about where we go from here. There's probably a gajillion things more I could share with you about this. There's no shortage of information, facts, statistics, logic, and reasoning concerning all of this. But I think this has highlighted some of the various factors between one option and another. Thank you so much for spending your time with me, and stay healthy. Bye-bye.